We are moving on up. By the end of our time here together, we will be able to describe the distribution layer and its properties. Moving on Up was the theme song for an old TV show called The Jeffersons. I think they were moving up an apartment complex or something. I don't know. I never watched the show. But we are moving up from the access layer to the distribution layer. And in this video, we want to take a look at how we build out that distribution layer, as well as the network services that we want to configure there. We've already said a few things about the distribution layer. For example, we know that it's usually a pair of two switches that are connected together. And we also know that we bring access switches into the distribution layer. And we don't really know how many access layer switches we have. It doesn't really matter. The idea here is that we can bring as many different access layer switches in to the distribution layer. Now, the number of access layer switches will determine, for example, how many switch ports we need on those distribution layer switches. So that is certainly a consideration. But in the end, we consider these really just two blocks. Number one, we have the access layer block. And number two, right here, we have the distribution block. So what do we need to consider when we're deploying these distribution switches? Well, the biggest differentiator from the access layer is typically that we're going to be running some kind of layer 3 services on these switches. And as such, we want these to be layer 3 switches. The distribution layer is where we're going to draw our layer 3 boundary so that layer 3 exists northbound of the distribution layer and layer 2 is what we use southbound. Now, there is a design architecture where we extend layer 3 to the access layer, and we'll be talking about that in a future skill. But for now, we can assume that access layers are going to be layer 2. And if that's the case, then the connection between distribution switches will also be layer 2. Now, as far as form factor is concerned, these are usually going to be either stackable switches or they're going to be chassis switches. We already talked about both of these options within the access layer, and both of these could absolutely be deployed to the distribution layer as well. Fixed configuration we didn't mention. Yeah, I mean, technically we could deploy a fixed configuration switch, but typically we're going to be limited on the port count on these. And so you just have to be careful if we're going to deploy fixed configuration switches as distribution layer. We need to make sure that we have enough ports to support the access layer. So let's talk about the network services that we can expect to exist on a distribution switch. Well, first of all, we have what's called switched virtual interfaces. These are otherwise called VLAN interfaces. This is when you get onto a Cisco switch and you say, for example, config T, and then we say interface VLAN 100. In a Cisco configuration, they like to capitalize the V when it's a layer 3 interface, even though you don't have to type it as uppercase. Again, VLANs are always layer 2, but the VLAN interfaces themselves, these are a layer 3 concept. And these are typically the default gateways. This will be used by clients connecting to the access layer to get out to the internet and other network resources. For example, connecting in down here in the access layer, I can expect to connect to maybe this SVI as my default gateway. And we usually have many SVIs on the distribution switches, typically one per VLAN. One other feature of the distribution layer we can expect to find on these gateways would be the first hop redundancy protocols, or FHRPs. An example of this would be HSRP, for example, the hot standby routing protocol that Cisco created. What that means is we're going to run HSRP or some other first hop redundancy protocol between the SVIs on these distribution switches. This ensures redundancy, for example, in my example here where this client is accessing the SVI on the left to get out to the internet, let's say, and then all of a sudden the switch on the left goes down. Well, we would want this client to be able to access the internet and other network resources by going to the switch on the right. In order to do this without reconfiguring the client down here, because, hey, if the default gateway, for example, is .100 and .100 just went down, I don't want to go to all of my laptops and say, never mind, it's not .100 anymore, it's .101. Right? That would be too much work, especially if that IP address hopefully comes back up quickly. So first hop redundancy protocols allow us to use the exact same IP address using this virtual IP concept, and then the .100 effectively moves over to the right side. We're going to be covering FHRPs in a future skill within the Encore playlist, so be sure to check that out. Now next, what we can expect to find in the distribution layer is routing protocols. These routing protocols are going to form neighborships or adjacencies to upstream network devices. Typically, this will be the network core. We might even want to do something called route summarization, which is to summarize the routes. Maybe all of these SVIs here, for example, we would want to summarize these upstream. What this means is rather than giving, let's say, 6 routes here, because I circled 6 different SVIs, rather than giving 6 separate routes, I summarize those into one route, and that reduces the overall load on the network core. Last but not least would be security, because we always have to consider security. What kinds of security mechanisms do we have at the distribution layer? Well, specifically, we're going to usually see access control lists deployed in the distribution layer. And again, where we deploy those is on those SVIs. Those VLAN interfaces will typically have the access list configured inbound. So for example, when I have a network device out on the access layer and they're trying to access network resources that they really shouldn't be accessing, well, that would be blocked by the access list that exists on these SVIs. Let's say this one right here. So there's a lot there. Let's go ahead and list these out. What kinds of services do we need at the distribution layer? First of all, those switched virtual interfaces, which is a fancy way of saying a VLAN interface. Next, we expect to run those first hop redundancy protocols on those SVIs. Third, we can expect routing protocols to be at play. And by the way, this includes route summarization. And last but not least, we have security, specifically via access control lists or ACLs, which will be deployed onto those SVIs. In fact, there's a lot here that ties to those SVIs. The routing adjacencies will probably be via those SVIs, and the FHRPs will be deployed onto those SVIs. So really, the fact that we have the VLAN interfaces at the distribution layer, that defines for us all of the other services that we're going to end up deploying. And of course, let's not forget the original purpose of the distribution layer, which is to take those access switches and aggregate them up under a single pair of switches. And with that, you are now able to describe the distribution layer and its properties. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.